Gary Hamill, and thanks for joining us at the Management 2.0 Hackathon. As you know, we're trying to reinvent management, the tools and methods we use in our organizations to plan, set priorities, allocate resources, motivate people, and so on, to reinvent those processes and the values behind them in ways that make our organizations fundamentally more capable. You know, in many ways, our organizations are beset with some systemic incompetencies. They're very good at doing some things, they're very good at focus and discipline and so on, but they're not very good at other things. Most of our organizations are not very adaptable. Often it takes a crisis to change a large organization. Our organizations are not very innovative. All too often it feels that innovation happens despite the system rather than because of it. And our organizations are not very inspiring places to work. We know this. There's a lot of data that says that on average, only a small fraction of employees are truly engaged in their work. We want to change this. We want to build organizations that are enormously adaptable, that are endlessly innovative, and truly inspiring places to work. And interestingly, when we look at the web, we already see something that's pretty adaptable, amazingly innovative, and quite inspiring. So one of the things we're going to be doing through this hackathon is we're going to look at the web, we're going to understand these deep principles, the design rules behind the web, the things that make it a vibrant and amazing place, and ask ourselves, how do we institutionalize those, how do we embed those in our organizations? But we also need to understand the fundamental root causes of these incompetencies. Why aren't our organizations more adaptable? Why aren't they running out to embrace change? Why isn't innovation everyone's job every day? Why aren't our organizations just amazingly exciting places to work? So we're going to try to leverage new principles, and we're going to get to that in the next stage of our hackathon. But for now, in this stage, we really want to uncover these root causes of these organizational pathologies, of these systemic incompetencies. And I'm going to get the process started by throwing out a few of the things that I think are root causes, things that really get in the way of our organizations being all they could be. But then we're going to ask you to build on this from your experience, from what you see in your organization, to identify what you think are the root causes, to provide some maybe practical examples of how you see those root causes evidenced in your organization, so that we can be sure when we come to trying to actually invent Management 2.0 to suggest hacks and fixes to this old management model, we can be sure that we're really honing in and dealing with the most fundamental challenges we face, the things that really limit the performance of our organizations. So what is it about Management 1.0? What is it about the values, the structures, the processes, if you will, that make our organizations less adaptable, innovative, and engaging than they might be? Well, I'll give you a couple of my thoughts on this just to get the conversation started, and I'm going to do this around those three categories. So let's start with adaptability. Why is it that organizations find it so hard to change in front of the curve? Why does it usually take a prolonged period of underperformance before a company will challenge the deepest assumptions it has about what business it's in, how it makes money, or who the customer is? If I was making a list of the kind of root causes of that corporate inertia, if you like, there's a couple of things I would put at the top of the list. Number one, I would put that pyramidal decision structure. You know, we know when you look at any social system, the more concentrated political power, the less adaptable or resilient that social system is going to be. Think about it. If you give a few people at the top of a pyramid a lot of authority, the primary authority to change strategy and change direction, you're also giving that group of individuals the ability to hold the company's capacity to change hostage to their own personal willingness to adapt and change. You know, if I had to point to one factor, one thing that makes organizations inertial, it's that oftentimes senior executives have a very hard time writing off their own depreciating intellectual capital. They know a lot, but often what they know is out of date. And it's very difficult for them to admit that decisions that they made 5 or 10 or 15 years ago are now kind of past their sell-by date, that the world has changed in fundamental ways that has undermined the value of their intellectual capital. So I believe we're going to have to radically redistribute the power for setting strategy and direction. Another thing I think that makes our organizations inertial is we tend to have monolithic structures. Our organizations are often divided into very large units with thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of people in a division or in a business. And within those monolithic units, there tends to be one way of thinking, one predominant kind of way of thinking about customers, the market, and so on. But again, we know when we look at biology that large things are not very adaptable. The biggest things that ever walked the earth, the dinosaurs, they're long gone. The smallest, bacteria, millions and trillions of them, they're still with us. And there's a real lesson there. If you want something that's adaptable, it can't be big. Now, we can still ask, how do we get economies of scale? How do we get economies of scope? But if you think about it, if you divide an organization up, you have a lot more units that can be experimenting with their own models, their own way of thinking. In smaller units, people have a higher sense of accountability. They don't feel like their contribution is simply going to get lost in this morass of a very large organization. There's a reason, for example, that at W.L. Gore, they split a business up once it gets to a couple hundred employees. The same also used to be true at Hewlett-Packard. There's a reason that at Google, the average operating unit is a relatively small team with just really a few people in it. So we're going to have to learn how to divide big things into smaller things without giving up all the benefits of scale. Let's turn our attention to innovation for a moment. What are some of the things that really undermine the capacity of our organizations to innovate? Again, let me give you perhaps my top two things, and I'm going to really be interested to hear what's on your list. I would argue, number one, in our organizations, there is it's unstated, but there's almost a kind of creative apartheid. There's a view that some people are really creative, but most people aren't. And if that wasn't true, I think we would have gone to a lot more effort to actually give people the tools that allow them to be creative. We would have taken time to teach them how to become business innovators. You know, obviously every company today has some kind of electronic idea market, some wiki somewhere where you can go share an idea. But often the ideas you find there are either on one hand pretty incremental or lackluster, or complete flights of fantasy on the other hand. What you don't find very many of are ideas that are both practical and radical. Because it takes some effort to teach people how to think in this way. To teach people how do you challenge the deep orthodoxies, the conventional beliefs that have grown up over time in your industry? How do you teach people to get at those deep frustrations that customers have, the unarticulated needs and desires that customers have that might give you a new way of creating something that's amazingly delightful or could even enchant a customer? How do you teach people to get at the emerging discontinuities and the trends that could be used as levers to create disruptive change in an industry? You know, we wouldn't expect somebody to go out onto a golf course and pick up a set of clubs for the first time and be a great golfer. But really in our organizations, even though we say we want innovation, very seldom do we teach people, do we train people how to do that. When I go to the web, given any subject, I can find great instruction, tutorials, other experts who are willing to help me, who will take all that expertise and help me improve the state of my thinking, whether it's how I shoot a great video or how you do anything really. But that really doesn't exist often around innovation in our organizations. Who are the innovation black belts in your company? Would you know how to find them? Are they there sharing their experiences? Are they accessible to everyone? Another thing I think that limits innovation are what I might call allocational rigidities, things that make it hard to move money and to move talent from old things, legacy projects, to new things. And I don't mean doing this at the level of the board, it happens sometimes there, but I mean 3 or 4 levels down. When you want to start a small experiment, when you want to try something that's new. You know, this links a little bit back to adaptability. We know that adaptability depends critically on the scope of experimentation. If you're not trying a lot of new things, you're not going to have an adaptable organization. But for many employees, it's pretty hard for them to get a small amount of experimental capital or even the time to try a new idea. If you doubt that, go to a first-level employee in your own company, your own organization, and ask them this question. If you had an idea and you wanted to get maybe a couple of $1,000s of experimental capital, and maybe you needed half of your time to work on this idea over the next couple of months, how many layers of bureaucracy would you have to go through? How many people would you have to talk to line that capital up, to get permission to spend your time in that way? You know, I've often been kind of amazed at the power that microfinance has around the world to help people advance their standards of living. The Grameen Bank has made millions of loans to impoverished women in Bangladesh, They use these small amounts of money to start small new businesses, and they do it with almost no paperwork and no collateral. And it's kind of odd to me that a 50-year-old woman in Bangladesh may have an easier time getting that experimental capital than the average first-level employee in a Global 1,000 company. We need to change that. You cannot have a monopoly on capital allocation. Let me use another analogy, Silicon Valley. Here we have hundreds, thousands of angel investors, hundreds of VCs, and often a would-be entrepreneur will go to 4 or 5 or a dozen VCs before they get funded. And yet in our organizations, there's typically one place to go for capital, up the chain of command. And so whenever you have one person or a few people making those allocational decisions, there's a risk that they don't invest in the new things. They don't invest in the things that might cannibalize a dearly beloved model. They don't invest in the things that they don't understand. And so we have to have more sources of experimental funding inside of our organizations. We have to break up those allocational monopolies, if you like, in our companies. So that's a couple of things that, for me, really get in the way of innovation. Too few people with the tools. They may have the opportunity, they may have an idea market, but they don't have the tools, they don't have the training, they don't have the mentors, and it's too difficult to get small amounts of experimental capital to try new things. What about engagement? Why are our organizations kind of often emotional vacuum chambers? Again, let me put a couple of things that would be at the top of my list. There's a lot of research that suggests that if people are not engaged, it's not so much that they don't like the work, although that can be part of it, but it's often that they don't really trust the managers they're working for. That they feel accountable to those executives or leaders, but they don't feel the accountability runs the other way. Or worse, they have somebody who is over them, a supervisor, a boss, who is a leader in position, but not really a leader in behavior. You know, in our organizations, I think one of the deep kind of pathologies, one of these deep flaws, is that power trickles down. Big leaders appoint little leaders and so on. And there are all kinds of things that result from that. But one of the things is, a lot of people spend most of their time managing up. It becomes a very political process where your primary goal is to please your boss, not necessarily help your colleagues, not necessarily add value, but just do what that boss wants you to do. And that boss has your career in their hands, which creates kind of a very toxic environment. We want organizations where every leader in a leadership position is there because they really have the leadership attributes. They're there because the followers want them to be there. They're willing to follow that particular leader. I call this natural leaders and natural hierarchies. So I think that's one of the challenges. How do we move away from this model where power trickles down to a model where power trickles up? Another thing I think that limits engagement, that undermines excitement and the spirit in organizations, is that oftentimes people have very limited autonomy in organizations. They don't have much scope in choosing their colleagues. They don't have much scope in choosing the work they do, and so they're in a slot. And we know when you put somebody in a slot, you're going to get slot-shaped contributions. There might have been many other things they would do, but if they don't have the freedom to join a community of passion, if they don't have a freedom to go out and work on what they find exciting, you're only going to get what that particular job demands. And that, I think, leaves an enormous amount of talent on the table. So for me, those are two critical things. How do you create organizations where leaders emerge from below, where they are truly accountable to the led? And how do you create organizations where individuals have a lot more autonomy, a lot more authority over their own work lives? You know, I find it kind of amazing. Let me give you a little example. The average person you meet walking down the street can probably go out and by themselves they can sign a contract to buy a $20,000 car. Put that same person inside of an organization, they can't requisition a $500 office chair without getting somebody else's permission. It's almost like the moment we hang an employee badge around their neck, they become stupid. Well, I don't think so. I just think they're tied up in rules and regulations, and we treat them as if they're stupid. So these are kind of my top few things that get in the way of being adaptable and innovative and highly engaging places to work. But we're going to have to, over the next few weeks, we're going to really dig into this. We're going to try to understand from you what you see as the root causes of these systemic incompetencies. And then as we go on and we start to hack our old management systems, we're going to ask ourselves, are we really tackling those root causes? So thanks again for getting involved. I think it's going to be fantastic fun to share all these ideas, to do this diagnosis together, and then take the next step where we start to invent Management 2.0. Good luck.